This is a Pulp Archive recording. All public Pulp Archive recordings are licensed under Creative Commons. For more information or to support us, please visit patreon.com/pulparchive. This episode was prepared by Soul and narrated by Edward, the digital narrator. The House of Fear by Albert Seymour Graham. Weird Tales, March 1925. This episode contains period-typical depictions of crime, violence, and mild profanity. Listener discretion is advised. A house of silence, broken at times by a weird wailing as from the pit. A house of dreams, grey in the moonlight, under the leprous silvered finger of the moon, brooding now a grim, grey fortress of the accursed, the stronghold of the beast. Dense pines grew about it, and when the wind wailed among them, it met and mingled with an eerie ululation, rising as if muffled by many thicknesses of walls, to end with a quick shriek and a sudden hush, broken after a moment by the faint echo of a taunting laugh. That laugh would have struck terror to the swart soul of a Lucifer, if Lucifers have souls, for it was like an eldritch, howling faint and thin, like the thin, tinkling laughter of a fiend, without pity and without ruth. Here, in the sanitarium of Dr. Helmholtz, there were secrets within secrets, walls within walls, downward as in Dante's seventh Hades, and from this monastery of the hopeless, there penetrated on occasion outward from its battlemented walls wild, frantic laughter, but there was nothing demoniac about it, because it was the laughter of the insane. But that other laughter, like a sound heard in dreams, passes by. If there were any such hearing, it would shudder and pass on. For the secret of that house of doom was terrible and grim, a secret for him who might have guessed at it, to be whispered behind locked doors and with bated breath. And there had been those who had whispered of the lost souls within those walls, and the whisper ran that they were, indeed, madmen who had not been always mad, but had become maniacs after their commitment to the bleak house within the wood. In a bare cell 6 feet by 6, a cubicle in which there was barely sufficient headroom for a tall man to stand upright, a figure stood, with its hand clenched upon the bars, staring outward at the grim wood visible to the south. Harold, Baron Banker, had abode here in this living tomb 3 weeks, say rather 3 centuries, in which, as in a nightmare of cold horror, he had been aware merely of a face. 3. Pointed, bearded, the eyes active with the malign intelligence, the lips smiling always with the cold smile of death. Twice a day, the small panel in his cell door had slid backward, without sound to frame in the opening the face of Dr. Helmholtz, like a face without a body and without a soul. Harold Baron Banker knew that it was not a dream that would pass, because, on the second day, the head had spoken. Baron was scarcely a coward. He had fought like a baited grizzly when surprised in his house by the men who had brought him under cover of the night to this prison house. Now, at the voice, like the slow drip of an acid, Baron stared straight before him with the gaze of a man who has abandoned hope. "My dear Mr. Baron," the voice had whispered, "the little matter of that check, if you please." "You will make it out to cash. Ah, that is good. I perceive you are wise." It had not been the pistol in the lean, claw-like hand, nor even the eyes brooding upon him with the impersonal cold stare of a cobra. Harold Baron might have refused if it had not been for the sounds that he had heard and the sights that he had seen. When taken at midnight from his cubicle, he had beheld the administration of the cone. And, like Macbeth, with that one sight and the sight of that which came after, he had supped full of horrors, until now, at the bidding of that toneless voice, he had obeyed. 3 times thereafter, at the command of his dark jailer, he had paid tribute, Nor had he been, of all that lost battalion, the single victim, for there had been others. Now, separated from him, scarce a dozen feet, a girl with golden hair sat huddled eyes in a sightless stare upon the stone floor of her cell. Like Baron, she had not been mercifully killed. She had been saved for a fate unspeakable, beside which death would be a little thing. So far she had been treated decently enough. Her cell was wide and airy, plainly but comfortably furnished. But as to that look in the grey-green eyes of the master of black magic, she was not so sure. There came a sudden movement in the corridor without, a panting, a snuffling, and the quick pad-pad of marching feet. The girl, her eye to the keyhole of the door, could see but dimly. She made out merely the sheeted figures, like grim, gliding ghosts, and a rigid figure on the stretcher, moving silently on its rubber-tired wheels. Then, at an odor stealing inward through the keyhole, she recoiled. That perfume had been sickly, sweet, overpowering, dense, and yet sharp, with a faint, acrid sweetness. The odor of ether, and then, although she could not see it, a man in the next cell had risen, white-faced from his cot, to sink back limply as the dark hand, holding that inverted cone, had swept downward to his face. Caroled, Baron sprang to his feet as the narrow door swung open, to press backward against the window bars as the high priest of horror, followed by his familiars cowled and hooded, entered with a slow, silent step. The doctor spoke, and his voice was like a chill wind. "My friend, I bring you forgetfulness, a brief leave of hours, and then, then, you will be a new man, a man reborn, my friend." Now, Baron, his face grey with a sort of hideous strain, stared silent, white-lipped, as at a low-voiced order the attendants came forward. The lean hand reached forward, it poised, darted, swooped, and in it was the cone, a choked gurgle, a strangled sharp cry, penetrating outward in a vague shadow of clamour, and then silence with the faint whisper of the wind among the pines, the brood of the rushing river, the faint half-audible footfalls passing and repassing in that corridor of the dead. Once, and it was never repeated. A man came there from the capital. He had demanded to see the doctor's patients. And as the investigator stood there viewing with a faint, creeping horror the nondescripts radiated before him, gibbering, mouthing in an inarticulate, furious babble, a man had burst suddenly from the line with a strangled cry. "Frank, don't you know me? I am Baron Carrold." The voice was the voice of Baron, but the face, it was the face of another, totally unlike. There had been no possible resemblance. But the man had been sane. The investigator was persuaded of that. He was suffering under a peculiar delusion. Indeed, but sane, the man rushed forward, then baring his arm, and there on that thin, pitiful flesh, which had once been healthy and hard, there ran a curious design in red. The investigator sucked in his breath as that telltale birthmark sprang livid under his gaze, for he had seen it before. The doctor's eyes narrowed to slits. Somehow the man from the capital gained the impression that it was the first time he had seen that mark. But the investigator could do nothing. Birthmarks can be duplicated. He waited then in a curious indecision as the bearded doctor interposed suavely. "Well, of course, Commissioner, you are quite aware, or you should be, how it is. These paranoiacs are noted for their delusions. They believe themselves to be someone else, and always a bank president, say a famous actor, an author, a great general. Now, Mr. Baron, you knew him, I believe." Beneath the silken tone there ran suddenly a hint of iron, of menace, veiled but actual. The investigator felt it. "This patient knew your name, of course," the suave voice continued. "Poor fellow. We must be gentle with him. And there the matter ended. Curiously enough, the man who had claimed to be Banker Baron had, after that first burst of frenzied speech, kept silent. Perhaps that mordant gleaming in the doctor's eyes had telegraphed a warning, a message, a command. Nevertheless, the investigator, still dissatisfied, took another walk through the corridors and determined to find the thing that seemed to be wrong. Corridor after corridor he traversed and found nothing amiss, but while going through a last corridor, he saw a woman standing before a mirror, gazing into the face that appeared to her, and laughing. But there was no mirth in that laugh. When the investigator returned, he looked at his own features in a glass, with the memory of that hideous laugh still ringing in his ears. He fancied suddenly beholding another's face where his own should be, and wondered whether that shock would not deprive him of his reason. For the woman he had seen staring at her reflection in the glass had had golden hair, pretty hands, and an adorable figure. But her face had been the rough, unshaven face of a man. But nothing could be done. The woman might have been born with the features of a man, but the investigator doubted it. Nevertheless, personal opinions have no influence over law, and law sometimes upholds crimes that have never been brought to account. The investigator went home, oddly shaken, to dream of a white face with staring eyes, which changed even as he gazed into the face of his long-lost friend, Harold Baron, to hear, even in his dream, a voice, and it was the voice of the living and of the dead. The Clock, by Arthur Styron. Weird Tales, June 1925. This episode contains period-typical depictions of crime, violence, and mild profanity. Listener discretion is advised. All my life, I have had a deep and abiding dread of monotony. The unvarying and wearisome sameness of life irks me and fills me with depression. I fear and hate all men because I am compelled to shun them in order to avoid that hideous mother of monotony, habit which tears my nerves to shreds and flings them mockingly in my twitching face. Regularity of any sort fills me with resentment and impotent rage against the scheme of things. The steady patter of raindrops drives me hysterical and gibbering, to bury my face amongst the pillows under a mattress, any place where the steady drip-drop is not audible. The sound of drum beats fills me with such uncontrolled rage and fury that I shriek aloud in my distress, and hurl stones or any missiles available at the miscreants who dare to provoke me. I cannot, I dare not, I will not endure drab uniformity. My imaginative and excitable temperament demands variety. Since I am thus constituted, is it any wonder that clocks fill me with hatred and terror, those prosaic engineers of space, with their dreadful unfailing cadence, their ceaseless vigil over man's allotted time, their steady and untiring tick-tack toward eternity. They terrify me, poison me, madden me, those hideous reminders of inexorable time, the faithful ally of unrelenting and unyielding death. I lived alone with an old woman who had taken me when I was a child from a foundling's home. Her I loved in a way, for she was kind and very old and feeble. Yet she always insisted upon regularity, eating, sleeping, and working at set times, and when I undertook to vary my life from day to day, such as retiring at noon, and rising for breakfast at midnight, in order that I might thus break the monotony of my existence, I met with such determined opposition from the old woman that her, too, I began to fear and hate. The house in which we lived was an old rambling country place of splendid and pretentious proportions, though with an air of pervading gloom and loneliness. The furnishings were mostly heirlooms and antiques of great beauty and value, of which the old woman was very proud. Among the chattels were 2 ancient and costly clocks, of rare and unusual design and workmanship. They stood side by side in the great hall, tall, grim, and spectral, regulating the household by their minute divisions of space. At least one of them did so. The other had not run for many, many years. The old woman had frequently related to me how that one had stopped at midnight, the very minute, aye, the very second her husband had died. Stopped, of its own accord, so she said, or by the hand of some unseen guest. With her own hands she cared for and cleaned and polished the two clocks. Every night, with unvarying regularity, she wound the living clock, which, as the other one had stopped when her husband died. Is it any wonder, then, that I feared these damnable machines almost as much as I hated them? I might have borne the awe and dread with which I regarded them, but the continual ticking of the living clock, the old woman's life-piece, as I called it, lashed my nerves to such a state of frenzy that, goaded beyond endurance, I would rush trembling and screaming from the house into the night, the cold, the storm, anywhere, away from that gruesome monotony, that eternal cadence. There was a chime, too, a chime that gave out a thick, gloomy, resonant sound, filling me with foreboding and terror, a sound that brought to mind grim death and a grimmer reckoning, that told of unsubdued passions and stern retribution. Each quarter the time increased, until upon the hour it became a complete stanza. So gruesome was the effect of this music upon my imagination that I could not rid my thoughts of it. I could not sleep, I could not rest. Always I was anticipating, waiting for the next installment. Sometimes in the small of the night I would creep from my sleepless bed and crouch in the dark, chilly hall, in order that I might hear the ticking and chiming more plainly, waiting for the dreadful music to start again, and then for the next sound, and the next, and so on until morning. At times I would make a determined effort to throw off the spell. I would say to myself, after the next quarter chimes I shall hurry to bed and fall asleep before it sounds again. Then, as soon as the quarter's direful melody had ceased, I would hasten to my room, shivering with cold and nervousness, and lie with tightly closed eyes, courting sleep. But big pointed hands would clutch at my heart. Brassy voices would laugh musically and mockingly in my ears, until, unable to endure it longer, I would rush back to the dark, cold hall where I could count the steady tic-tacs and listen for the unvarying chime the rest of the long night. As time wore on, I realized that my condition was becoming grave. Thoughts of destroying the clock occupied me constantly, but I could not do it because I feared the frightful thing with all my soul. On one occasion, I did approach the old woman with cunning and clever arguments as to why she herself should stop the clock, but she indigently refused. After that, so it seemed to me, I began to detect her stealing furtive and suspicious glances at me. She suspected my trouble. She knew. Dear God, I verily believe she knew my suffering and agony, and yet she would not stop that fiendish clock. So I began to burn with a remorseless hatred for the old woman, a desire for revenge. Then it was that I cunningly devised a scheme to appease my hatred of the old woman and rid myself of the monster at the same time. The old woman had said that the clock would stop of its own accord when she died. Very well. In this way she should accomplish what she had refused to do, and what I myself feared to do. Yes, I resolved to kill the old woman. I felt sorry for her because she had been kind to me, and she was very old and feeble. But she stood between me and my happiness, and she must die. That very night I would perpetrate the deed, and rid myself forever of this lesion upon my soul. After dark, I began to make my arrangements. They were very simple. The house stood in a lonely neighborhood. No one would hear. The old woman was very aged and infirm, and could make no resistance. She retired early, as was her wont. and I went to my room to listen and wait. I planned to wait until the midnight hour had struck, and then accomplish the deed before the clock should begin another day with its quarter's melody. Hardly breathing, I crouched in my room until the midnight hour had struck, waited until the last note of the awful dirge had faded into the dreadful stillness of the night. Then, carrying in my hands a small hatchet, I made my way stealthily toward the old woman's room. I moved very slowly and cautiously, inch by inch, creeping on my hands and knees so as to make no sound. On my way, I paused before the tall, grim clock to gloat. "Monster!" I gibbered in a high, thin voice, for I did not wish the old woman to hear and become alarmed. "Fiend! Damned soul! Never again will you raise your hellish voice. Never again shall I tremble and shake with terror at your taunting melody. Never again, for soon you will be forever stilled." In my excitement, I had unconsciously allowed my voice to rise. To a shrill, piercing treble rage possessed me. I rose to my feet and shook my fist at its evil shape. I screamed maledictions and curses at it and laughed with fiendish joy and triumph. "Agent of hell!" I shrieked, brandishing my hatchet and dancing about in a frenzy of hate. "You have spoken your last. You shall never, never use your brassy lungs again." The words were scarcely out of my mouth when, on the clear, dread stillness of the night, there broke a sound, hoarse, bold, mocking. A sound that froze my blood, that made my hair rise with terror, that filled me with surging fury. I had miscalculated my time because I had not gone by the clock. The demon was beginning to strike the quarter, to mock me, beginning, but no more. For with the first note, such a wave of rage and loathing swept over me, hatred of the monster and fury at having been thwarted in my plans, that I forgot my fear, forgot everything save that I was mad. I uttered an awful cry and leapt upon it with superhuman strength. I dashed it to the floor where it fell with a terrific crash. Shrieking invectives, I tore into its vitals with my bare hands, destroying, mangling devil, I raved. "You shall not speak. You shall not. You shall not." In a few minutes, it was a complete wreck. It lay on the floor, bruised, broken seeming, in my excited imagination, like a murdered thing. Laughing loudly and shrilly, and clutching in my wounded and blood-stained hands the remnants of the mutilated machine, I rushed to the old woman's room. She lay quietly on the bed, gazing at me with horror-dilated eyes. "See!" I screamed, throwing the bloody remnants upon the floor. "See, old woman! There is your clock. Now it will hardly stop when you die. Ha ha ha!" Then a strange feeling of awe crept over me. I ceased raving and looked intently at the old woman. In the pale light of a flickering candle, I could see that she still gazed at me with horror-dilated eyes. But now I saw that they were sightless. The old woman was dead. She had died when the clock stopped. Thank you so much for hanging out today. My name is Sol, and this is the Pulp Archive. Now, if you had fun, I'd appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, comment, and share. That stuff really helps. And like most stories we cover here, today's was recommended by you. So, if there's a story you'd like to see, send us an email at pulparchivelibrary@gmail.com. We'd love to cover it. If you'd like to support the podcast and keep us going, consider subscribing to our Apple channel or becoming a member on Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/pulparchive. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get access to all our podcasts and private explicit episodes that wouldn't be allowed publicly. We feature almost every genre of pulp fiction, horror, detective, western, and even sports. Special thanks to our patrons who make the podcast possible and make every episode of the Pulp Archive happen. Every episode is dedicated to our Patreon members. I truly could not do this without you.